Today, we will talk about the scandalously famous mountaineer Chantal Mauduit, nicknamed the Black Widow. Chantal was born in France in the Alpine region and was familiar with winter sports from an early age. Starting with alpine skiing, she quickly became interested in mountaineering. After obtaining a mountain guide certificate, she began mastering the most difficult routes in France. At the age of 22, Chantal participated in an ice climbing competition among the strongest climbers in Europe. She was the only woman among the 25 participants and took an honorable third place. This success drew attention to her, and she was soon accepted into the French National Mountaineering Association, where she quickly became a star. Soon, her mountaineering career gained momentum. Chantal went to the Andes, where she conquered her first 5,000-meter peak and later made an impressive descent from Huascarán, 6,768 meters, on a paraglider. This spectacular appearance had an impact. One of the climbers invited her to join an expedition to Mount Everest in 1991. That time, she didn't reach the summit, but she firmly decided to dedicate herself to conquering the 8,000ers. Chantal chose the most difficult style of ascents, without oxygen and with minimal equipment, but she had excellent endurance. Mountaineering at that time was mostly a male-dominated activity, but Chantal confidently paved her way. Her attractiveness also played a role. She was very popular among men, and some even accused her of manipulation. According to friends' recollections, she even provoked competition among climbers. During her second attempt to summit Everest in 1991, this competition led to an open conflict. The men fought and even threw stones at each other. For a while, Chantal's heart was won by American mountaineer Thor Kieser, who was madly in love with her. They started dating and planned to climb Fitzroy in Argentina. However, just before the trip, Chantal informed him that she didn't have enough money for the ticket. Madly in love, Thor took a job as a pizza delivery guy to pay for her flight, and a few months later, they went on the expedition together. During this route, Chantal suddenly lost interest in Thor, and their relationship began to fall apart. Although they were still roped together and trying to conquer the summit together, they were unsuccessful. Thor couldn't understand what had happened and desperately tried to win back her affection. Jennifer Jordan wrote about this. "If we reach the summit today, everything between us will be fine," Chantal told him before another attempt at the summit. Thor didn't understand why the summit should change anything, but he was willing to do anything just to win her love again. He decided that he would either bring her to the goal or die trying. Throughout the route, Thor led, correcting Chantal's mistakes. By 11 p.m., after 18 hours of climbing, he was overcoming one of the most difficult sections. The cold rain had soaked them to the bone. Their strength was running out, but he wasn't planning to retreat. Only a few meters remained. He was almost at the goal, and everything should get better. After all, she had promised. In the darkness, Thor grabbed a ledge but felt the rock start to shift. He froze, but it was too late. The rock came loose and fell downward. Thor managed to shout a warning, praying the falling rock wouldn't hit Chantal. But the rock hit the rope, slicing it like thread. Thor instantly fell off the wall. Tumbling and crashing into the rocks, he only thought about the fact that he was still alive. After falling 20 meters, he miraculously landed on a small ledge. Badly injured, with a broken face and a broken arm, but alive. Other climbers came to his aid and lowered him to the base camp. His ascent was over. Chantal decided to continue. She was invited to another team that planned a new assault the next morning. The only thing she told Thor before leaving was, "I just don't love you anymore." Physically and emotionally broken, Thor returned home. He even started seeing a psychologist who advised him to stay away from Chantal. But as soon as he found out that she was planning to conquer K2, he immediately looked for a way to join the expedition. Eventually, he joined the Russian-American team, which included legendary climbers like Ed Viesturs, Scott Fischer, and Vladimir Balaberdin. Chantal went with the Swiss team. The ascent was to take place in Pakistan, a country with strict Muslim traditions. But Chantal was not in a hurry to follow local customs. She walked alone through the bazaars in short shorts and several times narrowly avoided serious trouble. After 19 days, Their team reached the base camp of K2. They chose to climb in the alpine style, without ropes and with minimal equipment. This meant they did not participate in route setting, did not waste energy on installing ropes, but later used them, which caused discontent among other climbers. Chantal didn't like carrying a heavy backpack. Her equipment was minimal, and a plush duck hung from her frame. While the men in her team carried tents, stoves, and provisions, she used her charm to avoid hard work. Many doubted that the Swiss group would be able to reach the summit. A few weeks later, Chantal herself began to feel the pressure. She distanced herself from her teammates and got closer to the Americans, Ed Viesturs and Scott Fisher, almost as if she were choosing a more promising team. In the same group was Thor Kieser, but it seemed she didn't notice him. The Swiss team still attempted to summit, but due to a storm, they returned to base camp and then decided to end the expedition. According to Pakistani law, which prohibited switching teams, Chantal had to leave the mountain with them. But she didn't want to leave without even attempting to summit, so Thor suggested that she stay and climb with their team, despite breaking the rules. Apparently, he still hoped to win back her favor. While Thor worked, setting up ropes, carrying gear, preparing the camp, Chantal grew closer to his partner, Ed Viesturs. Eyewitnesses recalled that in base camp, she led a rather free lifestyle. Finally, on July 28th, the team, including Kieser, Viesturs, and Neil Badelman, left the base camp. By July 30th, they reached the third camp. Vladimir Balaberdin and Gennady Kopejko were 300 meters higher when Viesturs and Badelman were sleeping in one tent and Thor in a separate one. At night, he heard footsteps. It was Chantal. After waiting for the men to leave the base camp, she quietly put on her crampons, took a water bottle, and headed upwards. When they met, they continued the climb together. Viesturs and Badelman, dissatisfied with the weather conditions, began descending. The other climbers kept going, and on July 31st, the weather was clear. Thor carried a very heavy load, and soon they left some equipment behind, including sleeping bags, ropes, and most of the food to lighten their path. But they were stopped by the night. After a night without sleeping bags, Thor suffered from frostbite on his feet, while Chantal, despite her thin suit, handled the cold and altitude well, quickly acclimatizing. Thor decided to descend to retrieve the gear and bring his sleeping bag. Chantal asked him to take hers as well. On his way down, Thor met climber Alexei Nikiforov, who was also ascending without a sleeping bag, hoping to reach the fourth camp. Together they continued, but by evening they hadn't made it to the fourth camp and had to spend the night on the mountain's shoulder. Alexei lay between Thor's and Chantal's sleeping bags, and they spent the night there. The next morning, August 2nd, the trio reached the fourth camp, where they met Balaberdin and Kopejko, who were descending. In 1986, they had been the first to reach the Abruzzi Ridge summit, but their strength was running low. After handing over their things to Alexei, they headed down. It was time for Thor and his companions to ascend. Thor woke before dawn and began cutting a trail through half-meter deep snow. Alexei followed him. But 200 meters from the summit, Thor realized he wouldn't be able to reach the top and descend alive. All his strength had been spent on cutting the trail. Jennifer Jordan describes how Thor sat on the ridge, trying to spot Chantal and Alexei below to pass on his work. They appeared as tiny figures. At that moment, he tried to cry but had no strength left. Suddenly, a voice sounded, "If you want to live, go down." Thor didn't see anyone around but stood up and began descending. Chantal, following the trail, caught up with Alexei and met Thor. She offered to go up with him, but Thor refused because he had no strength left. "Whatever happens, you're a good guy," she said. Thor promised to wait for her in the fourth camp. Thor made the decision to descend and set ropes in the mountain's dangerous section. This saved Chantal and Alexei's lives. Meanwhile, Chantal, who hadn't spent energy carrying gear and had excellent acclimatization, became the fourth woman to summit K2 on August 3rd, 1992. But her joy was short-lived. Losing her sunglasses, she went blind at altitude and couldn't descend. She crawled into a snow cave where Alexei found her and began lowering her down. Chantal was unconscious and her hands and feet had frostbite. Alexei and Thor saved her, but without the ropes Thor had set, they wouldn't have been able to descend. Alexei fell from the mountain, but Thor's ropes saved him. Alexei was on the brink of death from altitude sickness when he reached Thor's tent. Chantal, blind, continued descending, and Thor found her, barely alive. He warmed her up and kept her in the fourth camp for 3 days. At more than 8,000 meters, recovering strength was impossible, and Thor knew that he had to not only descend, but also lower 2 almost dead climbers. The next day, when all 3 began descending, Thor and Alexei supported Chantal, who could barely move her legs. They would walk a few meters, then stop and rest. Thor was worried that continuing at night would be suicidal, so he decided to pitch a tent. However, Alexei, realizing how dangerous the path was, continued the descent alone, leaving Chantal's rescue to Thor. Chantal and Thor spent their 6th day at altitude, above 8,000 meters. The next day, with the weather improving, Thor contacted Viesturs and Fisher, who promised to meet them and help. But on the way to meet them, Viesturs felt an avalanche approaching, and Fisher was knocked off his feet, carried away from a great height. Viesturs managed to hide in a crevasse, but the rope was yanked, and he was swept by the avalanche hundreds of meters down. He desperately tried to stop himself using an ice axe. In the end, he managed to do so. He hooked onto a rock, and they hung a few meters from the abyss. No one was hurt, and they continued their ascent to rescue Chantal. At that moment, Thor was slowly lowering her down the rope. After a few hours, he met with Viesturs and Fisher, but by then, Chantal was completely exhausted. Viesturs immediately opened his backpack, knelt down, and offered her eye drops. He gently lifted her glasses and noticed that her eyes were inflamed and red from burst blood vessels. They continued their descent to the 3rd camp. For the next 2 days, they descended to the 1st camp, and eventually, Chantal began to feel better, enough to move on her own. Viesturs recalls that the K2 ascent was the only time in his life when he broke his own rule to always stay safe. Chantal hardly spoke about her dreadful condition, only mentioning pain in her eyes. However, she vividly recounts her arrival at the base camp, where she was greeted as a heroine. She remembers how Charlie brought her tea and cookies, the Mexicans congratulated her on the ascent, and she was surrounded by warm human embraces. The only person she did not mention was Thor Kaiser. He wasn't even named in her memoirs. Upon returning, she faced a fine for the unauthorized ascent, but she simply tore up the fine and left Pakistan. In his article about the memory of Alexei Nikiforov, Gennady Kopejko also overlooked Thor Kaiser's role in saving Chantal. He only briefly mentioned him as an unnamed American who didn't reach the summit. Instead, Kopejko credited Alexei with saving Chantal, claiming that he accompanied her until other climbers arrived. Nikiforov himself believed that Chantal did not reach the summit because she miscalculated her strength, although the ascent was still credited to her. After Wanda Rutkiewicz's death, Chantal remained the only woman to return alive from the K2 summit. When she returned to France, she was greeted as a national hero, but she no longer kept in touch with Thor. In the climbing community, Chantal gained a controversial reputation. Many believe that she used men for her ascents, disregarding their safety. She even earned the nickname Black Widow. However, climber Dan Mazur argued that Chantal was the antithesis to all those alpine schemes with big sponsors and Sherpas. She truly loved the mountains and used her body to exert influence over men. Despite her knee problems, she was strong and determined. Her ascent of K2 gave her the opportunity to find sponsors, and in 1993, she returned to Everest with the New Zealand team. Although there were 9 climbers and 8 Sherpas in her team, she claimed that she ascended faster than everyone and alone. She reached an altitude of 8,400 meters, but due to her slow pace and inadequate clothing, turned back, preferring not to risk frostbite. Later, she returned to Nepal and ascended Everest again, but this time her success was questionable. Without permission, she ascended the peaks of Shishapangma and Cho Oyu, for which she faced another fine, but she left for France without paying it, criticizing the bureaucracy. After that, she went to Mount Williams in Antarctica, where a film about her was made, and then returned to Everest to conquer the Northeast Ridge. However, due to avalanches, the expedition turned back home without reaching the goal. In 1995, Chantal found herself on Everest again, but this time she reached the south summit, after which she had to turn back. On this ascent, her slow pace again caused problems, and several climbers, including Ed Weisters, had to rescue her. Chantal lost consciousness at an altitude of 8,750 meters, and she was rescued at great cost. After being lowered to camp, she quickly recovered and returned to her usual behavior. Rob Hall, dissatisfied with the situation, excluded her from his expeditions, and her reputation in the climbing community only worsened. Many climbers, risking their lives, rescued her, but she didn't care about safety. Thor Kaiser, for example, recalls that he climbed with her not for safety, but because he loved her. She was like Helen of Troy. She enraged and inspired numerous climbers. In 1994, the French magazine Vertical wrote about her that her ascents seemed too easy to be taken seriously. After the death of British climber Alison Hargreaves, Chantal remarked that, unlike her, she was still alive. After 6 unsuccessful attempts to ascend Everest, Chantal shifted her focus to Lhotse, where, according to her, she became the first woman to summit. However, many doubt her story, as there is no evidence or testimony to support this ascent. She then continued her climbs, including Mont Blanc and other peaks, but left behind a dubious reputation, frequently sparking criticism and discontent among other climbers. The strange end to her story occurred in 1998, when she and Sherpa Aung Sering perished on Mount Dhaulagiri. The bodies were found in a tent, presumably under an ice block. No one witnessed what exactly happened. Chantal's body was transported to France, where she was cremated, and she left a will with detailed instructions, including burial and posthumous farewell requirements. However, her ashes were never scattered in the places she had specified.